Thank you, Sam. I appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeremy. I am going to give a brief workshop about doing oral history interviews. Just a bit of background about myself. I'm currently a grad student at San Diego State University. I did serve in the Marine Corps, and now I work with the MCRD San Diego Command Museum. If you're not familiar with where the recruit depot is, it's right there next to the airport. Anyone who's flying out tomorrow is probably going to see it, on the right side of the plane. So, and while I've been working with them, I've done, a few dozen interviews, worked on them or conducted them myself. And we've covered, projects such as the depot's response to COVID, talking to Operation Inherent Resolve veterans, and also MCRD San Diego recently began gender integrated training at the company level. And so previously, any woman who wanted to join the Marine Corps, even if they grew up in Point Loma, would have to go to MCRD Parris Island in South Carolina. And so we've been covering that transformation as well. So I'd like to kind of get a feel, how many people are familiar with oral history? Just a show of hands. Okay, so quite a few people. How many people have conducted oral history interviews? Okay, few. Has anyone been interviewed themselves? Okay, so we have some familiarity with oral history, but we'll go ahead and just kind of go over the basics, and hopefully I'll inspire some people to become a little bit more interested in oral history if they aren't already. So the goals of this workshop today, we're going to be talking about the definition of oral history, the benefits of it, how we can use it as historians, and some of the drawbacks and challenges of oral history, as well as how we can maybe mitigate some of those. So when you look at what is oral history, the Oral History Association defines it as a field of study and a method of gathering, preserving, and interpreting the voices and memories of people, communities, and participants in past events. So essentially, you're sitting down with someone, you're talking with them, and you want to understand their perspective. It's a recorded interview. It's not just a conversation that you're having with someone, because if you want it to be for the benefit of the historic community, then you need to make sure that you record it. That way you're able to share that information. It's also intentional. So you can't say that, let's say you have a recording of a pilot talking to an air traffic controller and it's recorded. While it's two people talking, maybe they're talking about some kind of experience, it's intentional. You're doing that interview to learn about a time, a place, an event, things like that. And with oral history, there's always a life history component. So what that means is that if I'm interviewing someone about, let's say, how the USS Midway Museum was built, and that's really the reason I'm talking to someone, you also want to know about what that person has done before that to understand their experiences and what made them qualified to be on that job, and maybe kind of what shaped some of their decisions. So the life history component is an important factor in this as well. So you may be asking, why is oral history important? I really like this quote where it's saying that oral historians have the superpower of creating primary sources. Of course, I like the idea of having superpower, right? Who doesn't? But that's really what you're doing. You are creating a primary source. You are identifying some kind of gap in maybe the secondary or primary source, sources out there. And that's your reason for sitting down and talking to someone, going right to the source and asking them the questions yourself. So you're creating that primary source, and then oral history can then be used to supplement other sources. In most cases, I wouldn't say just go off of what someone says is an interview and that's the end all be all for it. Oral history also has the benefit of being both a top-down history as well as a bottom-up history. So previously, most people focused on interviewing officials, high-ranking officers, things like that. They wanted to understand, what did the leadership see, what did they do, and then go from there. And that was kind of the story that they focused on. But also with oral history, you can talk to some of the lower ranking people, especially if we're talking about a military setting. So in addition to interviewing commanding officers and things like that, we also want to understand what do the junior guys have to say, maybe the non-commissioned officers, things like that. We want to understand their perspective as well. That way we have the whole spectrum of perspectives and experiences that we're capturing when we're looking at an event. So it's also, you're trying to capture their experience and what they've seen and what they've done in their own words as well. That's kind of an important thing to note with oral history. And it's also interesting because it's more about the perception over facts in some cases. And what that means is, I'm not saying that you want to talk to someone and just be like, yeah, okay, I don't trust any of this. But if you want to understand the numbers, if you want to understand, troop movements, things like that, you can look at unit diaries, you can look at logs, reports, things like that. Those are all ways to get information, but that's not necessarily telling you what someone saw, how they felt, what they believe happened, things like that. And so with these different sources, we can kind of come up with a better understanding of an event. So when we look at uses for oral history interviews, of course, research is an obvious one, right? Historians, they're going to go ahead and look at what people said and use that in their sources. Teachers, instructors, they can also use oral histories and have the students read what people said about the events that they themselves experienced. In the world of museums, we can use those in galleries and exhibits. I really like at the National Museum of the Marine Corps, they have like a handset, like what you see here. You can pick that up, you can press a button, and you can listen to Marine veterans' experiences. Maybe a minute or two, kind of an excerpt, but you get to hear in their own words what they did, what they saw, what it was like being maybe a prisoner of war, things like that. And it's a useful instructional tool there. You can also use oral histories for books as well. In addition to being a source that you're citing and creating a secondary source, there are some books like Melton McLaren's The Marines of Mockford Point. He wrote this book where he does an introduction and he breaks the chapters down into different topics, about what it was like for the first Black Marines when the Marine Corps was segregated. And so the first chapter is, he does a brief introduction talking about where did these guys who became the first Black Marines, where did they come from, talking about their background and experience, and then pulling excerpts from their interviews and arranging it in a way that you're getting these guys talking about their own experience. So that's another way you can use oral histories. A lot of people have an interest in using oral history for learning more about their family and genealogy, things like that. That's another great way to go ahead and use it. And I would say that's one of the more popular ways that most people get into doing oral histories. Finally, in addition to all the different ways you can use it, podcast that's another way that a lot of people are using oral histories today. The National Park Service had a podcast where they had excerpts because, interestingly enough, the National Park Service is one of the federal agencies that creates the most oral history interviews. And then the Smithsonian's Archives of American Art also had a podcast where they had excerpts talking to different people. And it's a way to kind of allow people to tell their story on a larger platform. So some things to keep in mind when you're doing oral history interviews, you want to make sure that you do your homework. When you sit down, you talk to someone, you want to make sure that you are not totally surprised by some very basic facts. For example, if you're going to sit down and you're going to talk to someone who was stationed aboard submarines their entire career, if they say that they were stationed on a submarine, you shouldn't be surprised, right? That's very basic. But sometimes it happens. People are just kind of like, I'm along for the ride. Let's see where this goes. You want to do your research so that you create better quality questions, develop a list, And then you can kind of use that as a springboard for doing your interviews. And then in addition to that, when you do your research and you have a better idea of what that person did, reading their biography, reading some different sources to have an understanding of what their experience may have been like, then when you're interviewing them, you need to be able to improvise and adapt as you go along. They may say something that kind of catches you for a loop, and you need to be able to explore that more in more detail, because if you just kind of like don't follow that because you're sticking to the list of questions, you're not going to learn nearly as much as you can. And it's funny, you know, these two things, these 2 points I just brought up, they sound pretty obvious, but I was actually having a conversation with Bill Hurd yesterday, and he was saying, you know, talking about oral history. Before I even said anything about this, he explained that he had an interview one time. Someone conducted an interview with him, had no idea what they were talking about, didn't do their research, didn't know what he was saying, and then he said some things, and then it just went right over her head. Didn't bother follow up with it, and ultimately ends up being a disappointing experience, both for the interviewer and for the narrator, the person who's being interviewed. So those are some things that it sounds pretty basic, right? But you want to make sure that you keep that in mind. And then also, kind of along the lines of what sounds pretty obvious, let the narrator speak. That sounds obvious, but when we're having a conversation with someone, there's kind of a tendency to, if you're listening to someone, you may not even thinking about it. You'll be going, yeah, oh, that's cool. You know, things like that. You're acknowledging that you're listening, but because this is being recorded, you can't be doing that because you're then talking over the person that you're interviewing. Additionally, there was a transcript of an interview that I was reading one time. I could tell that the interviewer was pretty new and inexperienced, enthusiastic, but inexperienced. And so she was interviewing a veteran. The veteran said, I grew up in this town in Texas. And the interviewer kind of cut her off and was like, oh, that's funny. My grandmother grew up in that area. And that's a great offline conversation, but that's not the kind of conversation that you want to have on the transcript. It's not about the interviewer, it's about the narrator. So let the narrator speak. When you ask questions, the goal is to ask more open-ended questions rather than closed or yes or no questions. For example, if you're interviewing someone who maybe was aboard the USS Cole during the bombing, you wouldn't say, oh, were you in the galley the morning that the USS Cole was bombed? That they're going to say yes or no, and then that's it. Doesn't really go, you know, anywhere. A better question to ask might be, where were you the morning of October 12th, 2000? Or what were you doing the morning that the USS Cole was bombed? And that gives a person to say, that gives them the opportunity to say, well, I was talking to my rack mate, and we were having a conversation about this. We were getting ready to go and do this task, and then all of a sudden, this happened. So right there, you learned a little bit more about who else was there. You learned more about the routines aboard the ship, and kind of what was going on in the different parts. So you can get more information by asking open-ended questions, and then it prompts further discussion. Because as the interviewer, you're there not because, you know, it's about what you have to say, but it's about trying to get the narrator to continue speaking and talk about what they experienced. You also want to ask all questions. What I mean by that is, if you asked me, you know, a year or so ago, if someone says they don't want to talk about something, if you should ask the question, I would have said no, because, you know, you want to respect the narrator. You want to, you know, and I tell people, I'm not trying to be one of these, you know, gotcha journalists, you know, trying to, you know, make you look bad or anything like that. If you don't want to talk about something, I'm not even going to ask the question. But then I was talking to an oral historian who said, no, you want to ask the questions, because whoever's looking at the transcript or listening to the interview later on, they're not going to have the context of seeing that you did talk to them about that. And so they're going to be looking at the transcript and they're going to say, why didn't you ask that very basic question? That's what you really want to know. So you say, I'm going to ask the question. If you don't want to answer it, you don't have to, but you need to have that check in the box to show that you did think about it, you did address it, and ultimately the narrator didn't want to talk about it. And then you can say and show that you did your job. Because ultimately, with oral history, you're collaborating with the narrator to create a primary source to learn about this, about their experience, and you need to show respect for the narrator and not exploit them or their experiences. So I'm going to skip over some of the equipment just because we're a little bit pressed for time, and I can go into that more during questions and answers. But there's kind of a debate whether or not to use video when doing oral history interviews, because ultimately, audio is the most important component to it. But there are pros and cons to using video doing an oral history interview. So some of the pros, I would say, and the MCRD San Diego Command Museum, we use video in doing oral history interviews now. So of course, I'm a little bit biased towards this, but I can appreciate the arguments against using video as well. So some of the pros are that you get to capture a person's body language and their facial expressions while you're interviewing them. I think that that's very important. There's subtle information in there that you might not be able to capture with just an audio record alone. Especially for a museum, it's good to have options for later as well. If you want to do an exhibit, or if whatever the case is, if you want to use more than just audio, you have that video option as well. You can put a face to a name, things like that. So that's an option. And then also, if like what we do at the museum, we use like our phones. An iPhone is a great camera at this point. And so when I have my phone on a tripod recording, and I also have a dedicated audio recorder, if something happens with that audio recorder, then my iPhone is capturing a backup. Let's say someone doesn't hit the record button when they thought that they did, because that's happened. Let's say, the memory card doesn't have enough room. You thought that you deleted all the files off it, maybe you needed to format it, and so it didn't get the whole recording, because that's happened. Or if you're just using battery power and then the batteries die, because that's happened, right? And these are all things you learn in the process of getting to know how to do oral history interviews, and how to mitigate it later on. But these are things that can happen. Luckily, because the iPhone is recording the audio in addition to the video, you have some kind of backup. It may not be the audio that you wanted, but you have something, so it wasn't a complete waste of time. But there's obviously cons to using, video in this, right? So when you use video, it's a lot more complicated because you need to consider what is your background, what's the lighting, all of these different things. You need to set up the video camera, whatever you're using, right? So that's another step in the process. I think that, having this sitting out and recording an interview, that's fairly unobtrusive. But for some people, they may feel comfortable knowing that they're being watched on video. So if you have an audio recorder, right, you set it on the table and you're just looking at the narrator and you're doing that interview, and then all of a sudden that audio recorder just kind of disappears. It's just two people talking. So that's a very valid argument. And then ultimately, when you get to the post-interview process, you have the audio, you have the video, you're going to need to merge it, and that's another step. So all these things kind of make the process a little bit more complicated and draw it out, but it depends on what you're going for in that final product for that oral history interview. What makes oral history, I would say, more accessible and more useful is the fact that it gets transcribed. it's easier for researchers to be able to look at a transcription of an hour, hour and a half, maybe 2 hour interview and be able to kind of skim. You can read more quickly than you listen. You can kind of skim through a transcript, especially if it's digitized, and you're able to, use the search feature to find a specific word or phrase. You're able to get through it more quickly. And as a researcher, if that oral history is going to be useful or not for your research. That turns, an hour, hour and a half video into something that you can really use. But that being said, the transcription process, I would say, is possibly the most expensive part. Once you have the equipment, the most expensive part of doing the interview. And it can also be pretty time consuming as well. It may take as much time, if not more time, than the amount of time it took you to do your research and actually do the interview and everything else before the point that you hit stop on the recorder. It can take that long and possibly more to do the transcript. So at the museum, we use Microsoft Word. There's a transcribe feature in there. If you have the premium version and use the browser version, not the the app on your computer, but if you use the browser version, you can do that. And I think the results are all right. But about an hour interview takes 6 or 7 hours to copy, edit, and fix things. And I'll show you some of those mistakes in a minute. But if you want to go the route of you're paying someone else to sit there and listen to it and type it out, and because, like I said, at the museum, we use Microsoft Word. So I turned to Wirecutter and saw what they recommended as the best services. There's an organization, Temi. It costs 25 cents per minute to transcribe. So a 1 hour interview is going to cost you about $15. If you want to use artificial intelligence, that's another way to go too. So if you use Go transcript, for example, that's 90 cents a minute. And then that's about $54 for 1 hour of interviewing. So if you multiply that by however many oral history interviews you have to do, that can add up. Whereas with Microsoft Word, you're already paying for it. Most people already have Microsoft Word. And so you can kind of do it yourself, but there is that amount of time you have to invest in. I still think that's better than having to listen to it and type it out yourself. And that allows us to kind of continue working with getting these interviews transcribed rather than wait on additional funding. So there's pros and cons to it. Now, what am I talking about with, the transcription making errors, right? So I interviewed these two chaplains about their experience during COVID aboard the base. And so one of them was saying that I got a call from the CO to cancel the in-person services, but to have the chaplains go squad bay to squad bay on Sunday mornings, right? But CO2 became CO2, like carbon dioxide. Squad bay to squad bay became squad beta, squad bay. And so it's all these little things that is really not that big a deal, right? You just go in there, you fix it, and you can use the find and replace feature to kind of figure out how often did it do it and then kind of replace all. There's ways to get around it, but ultimately that's the copy editing that you need to do, especially things like if we're talking about Marine Corps Recruit Depot, Paris Island. That's Paris with 2 R's, but a lot of times the transcriber or the software will think that it's spelled like Paris, France. And so it's all these little subtle things that you need to check for accuracy. And that's why transcribing can be one of the most time-consuming processes. So there's definitely shortcomings to oral history, right? It's not perfect. No source is ultimately perfect. And some people kind of look down on it a little bit. So there are real and perceived shortcomings of oral history. One of them is memory can be unreliable, right? It's true, it's not perfect. Many studies show this, but at the same time, there are certain things you can understand to maybe mitigate this a little bit more. Like if you're talking to someone who is, maybe they've retired from their career and you're talking about the span of their whole career, Studies have shown that when a person's talking about something that happened earlier in their career, rather than maybe in the middle or towards the end of their career, that's a more vivid memory, and they're more likely to remember the details from that. Why? It's because everything was new and exciting at that point. Everything's new. They're trying to figure things out. They're really engaged with it. But then later on, they become more mundane tasks. Maybe you're not even really handling it too much, or it's kind of routine. You just kind of forget about it, right? So that's a reason why people tend to remember the earlier stuff a little bit better. Also, perspective can be influenced over the years. I was interviewing a World War II veteran. He, served during World War II. He was on Iwo Jima, and I was talking to him, and he couldn't remember anything. Unfortunately, his daughter was trying to feed him information on the sidelines, which that's not great. Also, as far as practice, but he couldn't really remember anything. He couldn't even remember when he went to boot camp. It was off by like a year and a half. And so it's kind of a shame too, because I watched an interview that he did with the World War II Museum. He did it about 10 years earlier, and it was like, they were talking to a completely different person. So that can also have an effect. But also there's another interview that I did where I was talking to a Vietnam veteran who served as an advisor in the early 60s. And he was talking about things, in addition to his experience, he was talking about things that Lyndon Johnson was saying and doing, and things like that, things that he wouldn't have known at the time. But now it's kind of a part of the larger discussion. There are many studies, there are many debates about these things. And so he's kind of bringing that in, and it's like, okay, well, you wouldn't really have known that. And that's kind of more of a reflection of what we're talking about now and what's been written about it since. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that oral history is completely useless. You may go into the project or the interview thinking that you're interviewing someone for one reason, but ultimately you may end up learning something else. You're learning more about what has happened in the years since. And, how are we talking about Vietnam? How is it remembered? How is it remembered in the veterans' memory, the public memory, things like that? So that's something that's brought up, but there's a positive way to look at that as well. And ultimately, as I mentioned, oral history can be labor intensive. If you find a document, you pick it up, you have it, boom, that's it. You're not going out and finding the person and interviewing them and coming up with the questions and then doing the transcription and things like that. So those are some of the challenges, but ultimately, I would say that oral history, it's important, and it's worth going through all these challenges. Oral history is useful because it supplements existing sources, and you end up getting unique perspectives because every person you talk to has a unique perspective, and you're creating that source. And when you focus on their perceptions, that's what makes it really interesting. I didn't get a chance to go into talking about theory. I didn't go into the paperwork, the legal, aspects, things like that, because this is kind of a broad workshop. I can go into equipment if you'd like, but I wanted to make sure that I ended a little bit early so that we can go ahead and go over some questions. Oh, and sorry, one more thing. If you're interested in learning more, besides what I talked about, I would recommend Barbara Summers' Doing Veterans Oral History. That's a great resource. That was one of the first things I read, and it kind of goes over everything and really, shows you how to just get into doing it, because a lot of this you do kind of have to learn by doing it, making mistakes and things like that. But that's a great guide to kind of get you started, and that's specifically talking about the veteran community. And then Donald Ritchie's Doing Oral History. That's a great guide. That's probably 5 times the size, but it covers theory, it covers different debates, and it goes into more detail than the Doing Veterans Oral History guide. But both of these authors worked with and kind of collaborated with the Oral History Association, and I'd recommend just go to their website and see what resources they have. They can direct you in the direction of workshops and things like that, where you can try to cover more than we covered here in a half hour, over the span of a week or more. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to questions. Yes.
Thank you. I would first off appreciate the presentation. One thing that always comes to my mind looking at history, and I'm someone who really much believes in the necessity and the value that having those person experience that perspective provides. But I'm curious in terms of the actual aspect of arranging organizing the process of reaching out to individuals that oftentimes one has discussed situations that might be very traumatic and things that their person might want us to get out of personal issues. For example, one of my main areas of study identity history is that I'm involved and a large amount of what went on there involves organized sexual violence in certain situations. And I feel it's inherently really important to have that beyond historical events to have a perspective happen. But when you actually have to go about interviewing someone that's experienced, use of those nine things or those experiences, at what point do you feel that the warehouse responsibility and how they build out best to ensure gets the actual value of having an interview, or also understanding, respecting the actual narrator, how that is also done in the way.
Thank you. That's a great question. And that's definitely one of the ethical debates that has kind of been going on in the field, because previously oral history interviewers weren't necessarily as concerned about the questions that you brought up. And it's led to a lot of, questions about the ethics of doing it. Ultimately, it's about, as I said, showing respect for the author, and you kind of want to do a brief with them ahead of time. It's all voluntary, right? They don't have to do it, and you make sure that they know that, and that they have, that power to say, no, I don't want to do this. If they don't want to talk about something, they don't have to talk about it. If they want to take a break during the interview, they can do so. If they want to stop the interview, they can do so. If they decide that they thought doing the interview was going to be a good idea, and all of a sudden they just kind of pull out. While for the oral historian, it may feel like a huge letdown. Ultimately, it's their story, and that's kind of what you want to do. Now, when it comes to talking about trauma and things like that, you can do things as simple as, like having like a box of tissues or something right there ready to go, being ready to shut the camera off, things like that. I've heard of some organizations where they kind of include different, like, resources and things like that to, kind of point people in the direction of, in case, whatever the topic you're talking about, it may be, that has like vivid memories and brings things back up that the person wasn't expecting. And that's something that you could maybe put in there. But I would say ultimately, whatever you do, just make sure that you have that relationship with the narrator, show them respect, and kind of let them take the lead on this.
One other thing I'd like to know, if there's any situations or anything where I know our afternoons treated a person shall or decides that they don't want that to be published, does it actually occur in a situation like that?
I can say that from my experience, I have not seen that happen. I've heard of that, and there's kind of a range of ways to go about doing that. It all depends. It depends on the paperwork that was signed and things like that. And sometimes it's a matter of why, but generally the first thing you want to do is tactfully ask them why that is, and maybe try to reassure them. Some people, they just don't want the interview to be released immediately. And then you can say, okay, we'll put a hold on it for X amount of years, so it doesn't impact them or someone that is still alive, things like that. So that's generally the first way you want to go about it. But beyond that, I have not personally experienced that. Yes.
A great interview, a great presentation, Jeremy. Curious though, all books are not equal. You look at a book and say, well, primary sources, secondary sources, with narrators, is this some sort of process similar?
Yes, exactly what you said. Not all narrators are the same. Just like if you're having any conversation with someone.
Well, how do you select the narrator? Do they come to you or do you look for it?
It's a little of both. I would say most people aren't necessarily that they're not out there to talk about themselves immediately. So sometimes it does take approaching them with the idea and saying, hey, you experienced something that I'm really interested in learning more about. Would you be willing to do this? I have had people in the past come up to me and say, hey, I know you do these oral histories. Can we sit down and talk? Because I feel like I experienced a whole lot, especially people who are about to, maybe move on to another command or in another duty station. And so they're like, I want to get this out here because if I don't talk about this, no one else might know about this. So there's that. But then as far as whether or not the source is trustworthy, which I think you were kind of alluding to before, that's why you want to do your research ahead of time. So you have an idea of kind of what they were doing according to their biography and things like that. You do your research ahead of time. So you have an idea if they start saying something where things don't match up. It doesn't necessarily mean that the other sources are 100% correct. And this is where you kind of navigate. It's like, oh, are these other sources wrong? And maybe you've got something that just no one knows about, but that's where you are able to kind of press them for more questions, things like that. Ultimately, you find what they're saying doesn't match up with what so many other sources are saying. It may be worth noting in the transcript that it's like, other sources don't necessarily match this, things like that. I personally haven't really encountered that too much, but that is something to be aware of as a possibility. Yes.
Jeremy, is there any point in doing a sort of round table approach? I can remember once with multiple narrators. I can remember once a friend and I, who I hadn't seen in many years, together, and we were talking about particular times in our lives. And between the two of us, we were remembering a lot of things, triggering each other's memory. And I'm just wondering if that's a technique that would be useful in oral history, if it has been used.
Yes, and that's something actually. In the presentation, I had the picture of the two chaplains. Initially, I was trying to just interview one of them because ideally, you want to sit down, you want to talk to someone, and you want to understand what they saw and what they were saying. Because you run the risk of, if there's someone else being there, they say something, and then that's influencing their memories, and then maybe they were kind of like a little fuzzy on something. It's like, oh yeah, that must have been the way that happened. That's something that you need to be concerned about. Additionally, because as I mentioned before, when you're doing interviews, you want to let the narrator speak. And as an interviewer, this is a point where I need to not say anything and not talk over the narrator for the sake of the transcript, the recording, you name it. The other people in that roundtable approach, they may not have that same awareness because they haven't necessarily been trained, and so they're caught up in talking about their experience, which is exactly what you want. So that could lead to complications with doing the transcript. But like you said, when you're kind of talking with someone and you're catching up and you're able to kind of something that one person says evokes memories from the other person, and then you just kind of are able to extract more out of that experience. That's certainly undeniably a benefit. So it really kind of depends on how many people you're working with. I wouldn't say I would try to avoid 3. 2 might be okay, but 3 or more, that could get a little confusing. But it all depends on the situation and things like that, especially if you're talking with someone who would otherwise not want to do the interview. but it's because they're doing it with other people, they feel more comfortable and they're more willing to open up, then that may be a trade-off that you're willing to accept. Yes.
You ever find yourself in fact was invited, yeah, for interviewing someone and it's so, under the circumstances in which you find yourself doing.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the first part. What was the first part?
You ever find yourself re-interviewing someone? And if you do, what would the circumstances be that would cause you to do that?
I have not gone back and re-interviewed someone that I previously interviewed. Like, I haven't said, okay, I want to understand your experience, serving during Operation Inherent Resolve. And then I go back and do that again. Because it's like, oh, I didn't like the answer. It's the first time or something. Now you can, if you feel like there are questions that you wanted to ask and you didn't get a chance to ask, or you thought about it later on, then that's definitely you can do that. That's one way to go about it. You can kind of break up interviews where you can say, all right, we're only going to do an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours at most. Otherwise, we're going to get burnout. Like, I'm in the middle of interviewing someone. It's towards the end of his career, and so I think because I'm trying to cover over 20 years, and there's so many different things I want to dive in on. He's done multiple deployments, things like that. So far, I've interviewed him 3 times, and we're only partway through his career. So that's not that's not backtracking over the same time period. It's really just trying to pick up and move forward. And then similarly, I have interviewed people multiple times. Like, for example, the first female drill instructors in San Diego. I interviewed them right after they completed DI school, and then they were about to pick up their platoon in like a day or two, and then right before the platoon graduated, we interviewed them again 3 months later, and so. But we weren't covering the exact same thing, although we did ask some similar questions about maybe how the perspective of things changed, comparing before and after.
Jeremy, you have a question over here.
Yes. Jeremy, question about when you say video, I'm reminded there are plenty of times in interviews, people from props and things for reference, therefore what we maybe call references, painted by or black and white photos. Sometimes that's a kick of memory there. How is that something you might obviously handle that, say, take pictures for it, or what are other ways that you can that during the interview? They may want to use that during.
Well, if the narrator wants to look at a photo, they want to show it, maybe they're pointing out things in the photo, they're absolutely more than welcome to do so. I would say, and I haven't dealt with this firsthand yet, but I've thought about this, and I think if we're referencing a specific photo, because I would try to scan that and have that in the file for their interview that goes with the transcript, the paperwork, things like that. I may scan it, and I might be able to kind of put it on the screen when I'm doing that post-production interview with the editing. And so that way you don't have to glare and you're able to see the details better. It's better quality. So that's kind of the way I'd approach that. But if they're referencing something like that, I'd like to have a copy of that and keep that in the file folder. Thank you. No problem. Yes.
Last question.
And Jeremy, what have you learned about responding to potentially tense responses, maybe awkward humor usage, or someone getting on a political bandstand and start expressing their own personal?
So as far as my own personal views, like I said, I keep that out of the interview. I will kind of smile and nod, because if that's what the person is saying, and that's kind of, if they are expressing their experience and things like that, then that's up to them. That's how they want to, that's kind of what they want to talk about. But if they go completely on course, then I may gently, remind them. It's like, oh, well, we were talking about this thing. Could you elaborate more on this? But I haven't heard or experienced anyone getting very aggressive or to the point where it's like getting into, hate speech or more likely if someone is, I believe it's like libel, if you're saying something about someone kind of ruining their reputation, things like that, that may be something you don't want to have on record. And that's something where you could actually, as the interviewer, and you could maybe get caught up in a legal issue there. And so that's where you may want to say like, okay, maybe we'll cut that out or something like that. And just remind the narrator that that could be an issue and we should try to avoid that. So, thank you. I appreciate it.